I want to talk about M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable, which is a superhero movie, or is it, about a middle-aged father who gradually comes to realize that his body is, in fact, unbreakable.
It is the titular rule! No.
I am a huge Unbreakable fan, and I have a bit of a fan theory to share about it. But first, some context, or a lot of context. Stay with me, we'll get there. Unbreakable was released at an interesting moment in time, just after X-Men and a year and a half before Spider-Man, the first major financial successes of the superhero genre as we know it today. There were plenty of superhero movies out in the world before this moment, but they were generally much campier, they didn't have enormous budgets, they were made much less frequently, and they weren't taken nearly as seriously by the general public as they are now. Sure, Superman made audiences in the 70s believe a man could fly, but the success of Superman didn't lead to a ton of other superhero movies. It led to a ton of other Superman movies. The success of Tim Burton's Batman was much more inspiring to film studios, but even so, they mostly greenlit films that either were Batman movies, were Batman animated movies, or like Batman in some specific way, usually having to do with a detective or vigilante in a gritty urban environment. X-Men and Spider-Man were on another level, both in terms of production value and cultural impact, with X-Men proving that the superhero team-up movie was possible, and Spider-Man proving that audiences were completely into the idea of getting emotionally invested in a superhero's personal story and following them for multiple films. It was only after X-Men and Spider-Man that Hollywood really began producing a wide array of big-budget, interconnected superhero movies that appealed to longtime fans, converted new ones, made unthinkable amounts of money, and invited marathon viewing parties. Unbreakable was released when this explosion of superhero cinema was just beginning, which is one reason why its title card explaining to the general public how popular comic books are is a little funny today. In hindsight, it's clear that Unbreakable exists within a nexus point in American film culture, the exact moment when a bunch of Hollywood executives collectively realized the earning potential of an underexploited market and decided, yeah, let's just make these and nothing else till we die from drowning in gold coins. Now, setting aside the so-called East Rail 177 trilogy for a second, it's pretty clear that Unbreakable didn't have quite the same immediate cultural impact as X-Men and Spider-Man did. It wasn't nearly as profitable as those films, for one thing, but it also didn't spawn any immediate sequels or inspire a huge fan culture or anything like that. So, why is this? One theory is that out of those three films, Unbreakable is the only title not based on a pre-existing property, and therefore lacking the same kind of built-in audience who were going to show up no matter what. Sure, there were plenty of Sixth Sense fans and people who wanted to see Bruce Willis and Sam Jackson in the same movie again, but that's not exactly the crowd that superhero films were soon proven to cultivate. The familiarity theory is supported quite a lot by the franchise frenzy that kicked off in Hollywood after 9/11. The attack happened just as the superhero craze was beginning, and Spider-Man even had to pull a Twin Towers-centric trailer in 2001. 2001 was also the year when the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings franchises kicked off and dominated the box office for an incredibly long time, inspiring the cultural obsession with adaptations, franchises, and remakes we've become inundated with today. So the cynical take here is that the American public just wanted comfort food when they went to the movies in wake of this attack, and that meant familiar stories and familiar characters. Unbreakable was a completely original story, and its characters just weren't as charismatic and nostalgia-inducing as, say, Peter Parker is.
Pizza time.
I mean, we have rebooted this guy's franchise 3 times now, so surely people feel very safe coming back to his stories again and again. So the familiarity theory is a pretty solid one. However, I think there's something else going on here that sets Unbreakable apart. Not just from these two superhero films, but all superhero films. In fact, I have a bit of a theory of my own. What if Unbreakable isn't even a superhero movie at all? I mean, it seems like one. It's about somebody realizing they have superpowers. It makes direct reference to the world of comic books. It features a villain with an unusual identity and a dastardly plan. It involves fighting crime and saving the day. All the tropes are there. But it feels different from superhero movies in a way that's kind of hard to put your finger on. But maybe the simplest way is to say that unlike every film released under the Marvel or DC banners, Unbreakable is quiet, and Unbreakable is slow. For contrast, put back to Unbreakable. Quiet and slow. Kind of relaxing, even. Peaceful. Gives the viewer a lot of time to look, listen, and think. With that in mind, here's my fan theory. Unbreakable isn't a superhero movie. Unbreakable is slow cinema. I now probably have two types of viewers. One, people who have never heard the term slow cinema before and are thinking, oh, you mean like boring movies, right? Bad movies? And two, people who know enough about slow cinema as a concept to be thinking, Unbreakable is not slow cinema. If Unbreakable is slow cinema, what isn't? Is mayonnaise slow cinema? So I'm going to put my Unbreakable fandom aside for a second and address both of those responses now. Before defining what slow cinema is for the uninitiated, it's first important to establish that movies are a time-based art form. When you go to a theater to see a movie, you're going to be watching it for a very specific amount of time that the filmmaker or the studio has planned out in advance. My Neighbor Totoro is always going to be 86 minutes. 2001: A Space Odyssey is always going to be 142 minutes. Avengers Endgame is always going to be 181 minutes with no intermission because who needs bathroom breaks? Filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky believed that this quality was what film offered as an art form that no other did. He called filmmaking sculpting in time and viewed the filmmaker as the sculptor whose responsibility it was to shape the viewer's experience, not just visually or dramatically, but temporally. On the other hand, if you go to a museum and look at a painting, you can look at it for as much or as little time as you want. Some people just glance as they walk past, while others may sit and take it in for an hour or more. Your temporal engagement with this form of art is completely flexible. But movies are completely rigid, provided you're not watching them on TV with commercial breaks or on fast forward like some kind of monster. The time you spend with it is part of the art. Because of this, slow is one of the worst criticisms a movie can get. Because if you're bored by a movie, too bad. You're stuck with it for as long as the runtime says you are. So most filmmakers prioritize making their films as entertaining as possible, so you don't really feel the time passing. There's an argument to be made that the best way for a movie to do this is to focus on movement and action, and some might say capturing movement and action is what movies, motion pictures, were invented for, what they're best at. So prevailing wisdom suggests that the best way for a movie to pass the time is to pass it quickly. And most movies cater to that mindset, especially superhero movies, which are constantly giving audiences more action, more conflict, and more characters to keep things interesting. However, there is another cinematic tradition that sets out to have the opposite effect, to make you feel time, usually by slowing movement and action down, to make time into another tool at the filmmaker's disposal, just like color and lighting. This tradition is often called slow cinema, but there are a ton of other names for it as well. Slow movies, durational cinema, static cinema, and transcendental style. The term slow cinema has only been around since the early 2000s, but the techniques it describes have been applied far and wide, from the films of Stanley Kubrick, to the Paranormal Activity movies, to Oscar contenders like Moonlight and Widows. And the tradition has been around since cinema's very early history. In the book Transcendental Style in Film, critic, director, and screenwriter Paul Schrader studies the way that time works in the movies of Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer to create a deeply spiritual stirring in their viewers. He says that going to a film is like going to church. One doesn't leave a church after half an hour because it's boring. But in an attempt to create this spiritual experience, Schrader says that slow cinema works against the grain of cinema itself. It turns its back on what movies do best. It replaces action with stillness, empathy with distance. The techniques of slow cinema are all, to varying degrees, distancing devices. Slow cinema is passive aggression par excellence. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would anyone subject themselves to that? What's the benefit of allowing a director to passive-aggressively bore you? There's not really one answer. Schrader obviously thinks there's a spiritual dimension to slowness in movies. Some might say that slowness can get an audience more interested rather than less, in the same way that suspense makes for better scares in horror movies. Others say that it makes for a relaxing, aesthetically pleasing experience as a counterpoint to our stressful, fast-paced world, the same way a hot bath or a deep massage would. Another theory is that it allows movies to better represent the existence of people whose lives are inherently slow due to poverty or other restrictive circumstances. But for me, the answer is just that slow cinema simply allows movies to work differently, whatever that might mean. If a filmmaker's primary goal is always to keep their audience entertained, there are certain limits on what kinds of experiences their movie can create. Slow cinema is able to create experiences that simply aren't possible otherwise. Let's look at an example from the film Uncle Boon Me, Who Can Recall His Past Lives. This is the first shot of the film. We see a bull tied to a tree, looking around. Now, our immediate reaction to this image might be that that's all there is. It's just a bull. But as the shot goes on, longer and longer, eventually lasting over a full minute, the time we're spending might start to change how we're thinking about this creature. We might start to imagine what it's thinking. And then the next shot is a 12-second close-up, which even more invites us to start thinking about this creature as having an interior life in the same way that humans do. It starts to look out, and we can assume that it wants to escape these restraints it's been put in. This is not a scene where nothing is happening. Something is happening, but we're the ones doing it. We are projecting consciousness onto this animal in a way that we wouldn't if we only saw it for a couple of seconds. That ends up being an important step of getting the audience invested, considering the rest of this sequence involves the bull escaping, and the rest of this film, deeply rooted in Buddhist mysticism, involves the various non-human forms our protagonist has embodied throughout his spiritual life. Maybe you could convey this information more efficiently in another form, but only slow cinema is this effective at getting you to really feel it. By the way, the director of this film, Apichatpong Weerasethakul, has named Shyamalan as one of his favorite filmmakers alongside slow cinema titans Bela Tarr and Tsai Ming Lang. Just saying. Now, obviously, most of the stuff Shyamalan has made does not fit into this classification. Split and Glass certainly don't qualify, which is why I'm presently ignoring the East Rail 177 trilogy, available exclusively at Walmart. But for the eggheads out there asking how I could possibly put Unbreakable in the same category as Uncle Boon Me or The Turin Horse, I have a question to ask in return. What qualities make something slow cinema? Does slow cinema need to have as little dialogue as possible? Or can it be nothing but dialogue? Does slow cinema need to rely on extreme wide shots? Or can long close-ups work just as well? Does slow cinema need to avoid ever moving the camera? Or can it move incessantly? Does slow cinema need to work in a dreary, drab color palette? Or can it be vivid and borderline psychedelic? My point here is that slow cinema as a concept is fairly foggy and multifaceted, and attempts to draw a very narrow box around what can be considered slow cinema reminds me of the obsession over true Norwegian black metal. Is your music only black metal if you're burning down churches and murdering people? Is your cinema only slow if it's an absurdly long endurance test? I don't think so. Like animation, I think slow cinema is more of a form than a hard and fast genre, and that form can accommodate a vast array of stories. Very silly comedies, bleak family dramas, surreal spirals of madness, or swooning romances. Slow cinema can also be fused with other cinematic forms, as Paul Schrader discussed in his chapter on Carl Dreyer. It's pretty easy to see how Dreyer's Joan of Arc mixes slow cinema with montage cinema, and how Dreyer's Vampire mixes slow cinema with expressionism. The form is versatile enough to include both, and I'm arguing here that it's also versatile enough to include something like Unbreakable, which is slow cinema mixed with the superhero formula. In fact, the medium is so diverse that some academics have suggested using the term slow cinemas rather than slow cinema to better differentiate between the cinematic traditions of different geographic regions. Slow cinema in Thailand feels very different from slow cinema in France or the US, for example. But that's a little too galaxy brain for me at the moment. We got superheroes to talk about. One universal trait of slow cinema is the long take, often tracing a very gradual action, showing a repetitive process, or just illustrating complete stillness like Uncle Boonmy's bull. Unbreakable is full of long takes, which should be obvious from the opening scenes, the first of which is a 2-minute-long continuous shot in the delivery room after Mr. Glass is born, and the second of which includes an almost 4-minute shot of David Dunn flirting with a stranger on a train. What's more, this second shot slowly floats back and forth between the two speakers, the back and forth being a trademark move of slow cinema filmmaker Ho Xiaoshen, especially his film Flowers of Shanghai. It has become somewhat fashionable to use long takes to show off flashy action sequences in recent years, usually with some digital cheating, but Hollywood almost never uses them to linger on mundane human moments like Unbreakable does here. Slow cinema, however, makes this a prime focus. Paul Schrader calls this style of filmmaking the everyday. Long takes, observing everyday life, until the stasis is broken by some sort of divine or supernatural presence. Shot length is also something that can be quantified, which makes my job pretty easy here. According to Cinemetric's, Unbreakable's average shot length is 19.5 seconds. Now, let's compare that to superhero movies released around the same time. X-Men's average shot length is only 1.7 seconds. Spider-Man's is about 4.3, which makes the average shot in Unbreakable almost 5 times longer than the average shot in Spider-Man, and over 10 times longer than the average shot in X-Men. This is really apparent when you look at some of the action in X-Men compared to the biggest action sequence in Unbreakable, which is a single 96-second take. Alternatively, let's compare Unbreakable's average shot length to some notable slow cinema from around the same time period. Claire Denis' Beau Travail, released in 1999, has an average shot length of 13.4 seconds, which is less than Unbreakable. Lucrecia Martel's La Ciénaga, released in 2001, has an average shot length of 7.9 seconds, less than half of Unbreakable's. There are definitely more extreme cases that make Unbreakable seem much more speedy, but by the numbers, Shyamalan's level of patience and restraint in Unbreakable is much closer to somebody like Claire Denis than somebody like, Bryan Singer. Unbreakable achieves such a drawn-out average shot length by often letting conversations play out in full as one master shot conversation, where we can see both actors rather than constantly cutting back and forth between their faces. Shot reverse shot being a near universally applied technique that has honestly started to get on my nerves a little bit after getting used to the ways conversations unfold much more naturally in slow cinema. In terms of how these conversations are framed, there's usually some sort of interesting environmental framing that boxes their conversations in, as is the case in movies like In the Mood for Love, Still Life, and Columbus. This type of framing is by no means exclusive to slow cinema, but because slow cinema lets the shots last longer than most movies do, it really invites you to examine the composition of the shot and consider how the framing is reflecting the dynamics between the characters, as is the case here when the emotionally distant David Dunn is talking to his wife from through a doorway and up a staircase. Another technique worth mentioning along with Shyamalan's long takes is the use of the slow dissolve in Unbreakable. Dissolving is a really common editing technique that gets used in just about everything, but it usually only lasts a second or two, max. In Unbreakable, dissolves can often last as long as the shot itself, and when you combine that with takes that are already very long, it makes them feel like there's no cutting at all, just one fluid movement from one perspective to the next. My favorite example of this in the world of slow cinema happens in Meek's Cutoff, which dissolves between two different wordless walking scenes to create a feeling that is both weary and sublime at the same time. Whereas Ethicul also does this to beautiful effect in Cemetery of Splendor, fading together this shot of people circulating through a mall with this gorgeous neon-drenched scene of hospital patients sleeping. Coincidentally enough, Unbreakable's longest dissolves also happen in hospitals, the first being when Shyamalan slowly fades between a shot lasting 120 seconds and a shot lasting 67 seconds, creating a very ghostly atmosphere to surround a man who should be dead. Much like the hospital scene from David Lowery's A Ghost Story, which holds a static image for a full minute before its dead protagonist bolts upright. Another example of this in Unbreakable comes when Mr. Glass is hospitalized and Shyamalan slowly fades between a close-up of his eye and a reverse shot of David Dunn's wife being viewed through a window with an eye-shaped decal on it, creating a voyeuristic effect and implying a sinister intent we aren't getting verbally from Mr. Glass. This slow zoom is something Shyamalan does a couple times throughout Unbreakable. But the most interesting example is when David Dunn goes on a quote-unquote first date to start things over with his wife. This slow zoom, along with some beautiful silhouette work, gets used here to show a gradual but growing sense of intimacy between the two partners. The slow zoom gets used in slow cinema as well, especially in the movies of Hong Sang-soo, who often uses them as a replacement for a cut or to let a scene gradually become more comically awkward. The most famous usage, however, is probably Stanley Kubrick's slowest film, Barry Lyndon, but Kubrick is usually zooming out to make his characters seem more insignificant or more picturesque, whereas Shyamalan is usually trying to do something similar to this shot in Birth, which slowly zooms in to a character's tightly controlled face to dig deeper into what's going on underneath. Speaking of what's going on underneath, that brings us to blank affect, the idea that if an actor withholds their emotions rather than expressing them directly, they can suggest a deeper well of feeling. The idea was developed by slow cinema pioneer Robert Bresson, who often cast non-actors who wouldn't bring their own screen persona to the role. He called them models rather than actors and made them redo a shot again and again until all their energy was drained from the performance, creating a blank slate that the audience could project onto. My favorite use of blank affect is in the Claire Denis film Beau Travail, in which a stoic military commander represses an unexpected longing for one of his male inferiors. It's all communicated through glances and what's not been said, suggesting a clear difference between the combative, stern way that this character is expected to behave and the feelings he's keeping bottled up inside. A very similar type of homoerotic blank affect was famously used in the Oscar-winning film Moonlight, which, as my friend Nathan has pointed out in a video essay for Fandor, infuses stylistic traits of slow cinema with a chopped and screwed hip-hop sensibility, in which director Barry Jenkins has said is directly inspired by the work of Claire Denis.
Because Claire Denis is the greatest filmmaker on the planet.
In the case of Unbreakable, most of our blank affect is cast by David Dunn, who constantly feels the need to keep his strong exterior rock solid and his vulnerability hidden. First as a football player, then as a security guard, then as a superhero. But of course, this veneer of masculine stoicism is not the full truth, which brings me to my final point. As we can see in movies like Beau Travail, Moonlight, as well as Old Joy and Climates, the restrained, tightly controlled style of slow cinema is really well suited for exploring the concept of masculinity, the strong and silent type being one form of idealized masculinity, all forms of which tend to prioritize strength over vulnerability, logic over emotion, and independence over connection. But these ideas of what masculinity can be often make for a pretty confining and unfulfilling box for the boys who are implicitly taught these ideas through their role models, often fathers, sports stars, superheroes. David Dunn is all of these things, and his unbreakability doesn't just refer to his physical body, but also his emotional state, his inability to really connect to his own loved ones due to being so closed off and hardened. He's reckoning with existential despair in this film, feeling as though he has not lived up to some sort of masculine potential due to choosing a soft domestic life over a rugged athleticism he left behind. But he's not letting anyone in. He's dealing with this crisis alone. He's obviously grown distant from his family because of this, and it's eating him alive. And that is the conflict of Unbreakable. It's not, will he or won't he become a superhero? It's, will he or won't he learn to actively love his family? Will he or won't he become a good husband and a good father? These ideas are under-discussed in conversations about Unbreakable, but it's pretty clear from the opening scenes what this movie is about. That almost 4-minute shot of David Dunn on the train focuses not on any sort of danger that he will eventually survive, but rather the question of whether or not he's going to cheat on his wife. And the only insert shots we get here are of a child, who serves as the camera's POV, and also maybe David's conscience as he internally debates giving up on his family. David surviving the train crash does set up his superhero origin story, but more importantly, it gives him a second chance with his wife and kid. That's the focus that is achieved from all these long takes, the back and forth, the everyday, the blank affect. They all function to prioritize the human drama that is the true beating heart of this movie. To go back to the numbers for a second, Unbreakable doesn't make the suggestion that David Dunn might be a superhero until about the 30-minute mark of this film. By contrast, the status of David Dunn's marriage is called into question less than 5 minutes into the film, when he eyes this lady's midriff and promptly takes off his wedding ring. In between those plot points, we get 2 different long and understated conversations between David and his wife, the style of which really emphasizes how much they've grown apart. The phenomenon of male emotional repression we see in Unbreakable is something that feminist author Bell Hooks writes about extensively in her book The Will to Change. In it, Hooks outlines really persuasively the ways in which gender norms hurt men psychologically and keep them from forming and maintaining fulfilling relationships. According to Hooks, men are, consciously or unconsciously, imprisoned by a system that undermines their mental health, because patriarchy as a system has denied males access to full emotional well-being. This is the internal battle we see David Dunn facing in relation to his family, but this emotional crisis is never stated outright because it's not allowed to be, according to masculinity norms. Hooks writes that in a patriarchal culture that socializes men to deny feelings, we doom them to live in states of emotional numbness, which makes slow cinema and its use of blank affect an ideal aesthetic for exploring this extremely common mental state. Hooks explains that this emotional numbness is taught indirectly to young boys through abuse or bullying that coerces them into fitting a rigid standard of masculinity. This is a phenomenon we don't see David experience directly because we only see him from his college years onward. We do, however, see the emotional scarring of Elijah Price, later known as Mr. Glass. A foil to David Dunn's strength, Mr. Glass is the personification of vulnerability. He's biologically fragile and therefore seen as too weak to be treated with respect by other boys on the playground, so he retreats into a fantasy world of comic books, where superhuman strength is commonplace, and where he might imagine some sort of place for himself as an arch-villain standing in opposition to an unbreakable hero. He is denied a chance to live fully in his vulnerability, so he lives a life of anger, something that Bell Hooks also identifies as a common phenomenon in her book. Because, of course, men aren't expected to repress all emotions, just the feminine ones. Anger, aggression, and rage are all encouraged by the social systems and entertainment we put in front of boys. According to Hooks, boys are encouraged by patriarchal thinking to claim rage as the easiest path to manliness, and much of the anger boys express is itself a response to the demand that they not show any other emotions. This socially acceptable anger is sometimes manifest through violence, either violence that is directed at the self or violence directed at others. This is a major factor for why the suicide rate is so much higher for men than for women. It's why assault, abuse, and homicide are much higher for men as well. This is why, as I outlined in my previous video essay on guns and horror movies, practically all mass shooters have been male. These norms hurt men and in turn encourage men to hurt others as a way to deny vulnerability. We see this in slow cinema that deals with masculinity. In Beau Travail, emotional repression leads to violence directed at the self, as that film ends in suicide. In Moonlight, homophobic bullying leads to violence directed at others, getting the protagonist in trouble with the law. In Unbreakable, David Dunn is coerced into vigilante violence as a way to seek emotional fulfillment, as is the case in many superhero and vigilante films like it. Consider the Batman franchise, the violence of which is built on a foundation of grief and trauma over Bruce Wayne's dead parents. Consider the Spider-Man franchise, which is built on the grief and trauma over the dead Uncle Ben. Consider the Punisher franchise, built on the grief and trauma over Frank Castle's dead family, as is the case in the Punisher's vigilante film inspiration, Death Wish. These are all characters who are emotionally wounded and fill that void by defining themselves through the violence they inflict upon others. And this is the ultimate point of Bell Hooks in The Will to Change. She doesn't hate men or seek to destroy masculinity, but rather to redefine it in order to help men live more fulfilling and benevolent lives. According to Hooks, the crisis facing men is not the crisis of masculinity, it is the crisis of patriarchal masculinity. The idea that males are inherently dominating, superior to everything deemed weak, especially females, and endowed with the right to maintain that dominance through violence. Now, Hooks herself admits that the question of what the alternative to patriarchal masculinity might be must still be answered. Clearly, men need new models for self-assertion that do not require the construction of an enemy other for them to define themselves against. It's easy to see this oppositional self-definition at work in the many identity-defining rivalries on the internet. There's silly stuff like the Marvel-DC rivalry, the PlayStation-Xbox rivalry. There are countless sports rivalries. There are also people who hate immigrants, and especially people who hate feminists, even though feminists like Bell Hooks do not hate them. Taking on one of these oppositional identities stokes up a lot of unnecessary rage. Consider how fundamental this idea of oppositional self-definition is in the world of superhero action movies, in which heroes and villains are often presented as two sides of the same coin. That's why you get big speeches along the lines of, "We're not so different, you and I," in so many of these things.
You and I are not so different.
I made you. You made me first.
You complete me.
It's also why the Lego Batman movie ends on such a great joke.
I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I hate you, Joker.
I hate you too.
I hate you more.
I hate you the most.
I hate you forever.
But this idea of men needing to define themselves in opposition to something else is the tragedy of Elijah Price. Without any role models teaching him to be both masculine and vulnerable, he instead defines himself through violence in opposition to an imagined other. And the even greater tragedy is that he is able to successfully convince David Dunn to embody the role of that imagined other. This is a context in which Shyamalan's reputation for twist endings really works. In the final stages of David Dunn's dramatic arc, it seems as though he has resolved his conflict. He wasn't happy with his role in life as a blue-collar worker and supposedly emasculated family man, so he takes Mr. Glass up on his offer to become a vigilante, and the success of his vigilante violence is tied directly to his satisfaction in the home. The long take of his final showdown is dissolved directly into a long take of his laying down with his wife in bed. But Shyamalan knows that this supposedly happy ending is deeply messed up. This is an instance of a man's crisis of masculinity being resolved through the exact masculinity norms that sent him into this spiral. So we get a twist ending, in which David Dunn finds out he's been played by Mr. Glass, someone who has fully bought into the idea of masculinity being won through strength rather than through vulnerability. In order for David to truly resolve his initial conflict with domestic life, he needs to learn not to be strong, but to be vulnerable. And so the movie ends not on a note of victory, but a note of tragedy. David Dunn was tricked into violence by Mr. Glass in the same way that both he and Mr. Glass were tricked into emotional repression by restrictive masculinity norms supposing the ideal man to be unbreakable. And what sets Unbreakable apart from other superhero movies that also fixate on emotionally wounded vigilantes is its form, slow cinema, which tends to be a much more effective and persuasive way of communicating these ideas than action movies tend to be. It's an issue of form and content, which ideally should be working in tandem with one another. Even if your action movie is trying to be a deeply psychological character study or ultimately come down against vigilante violence, it's still going to be an action movie in terms of its form, and therefore violence is always the thing thrilling the audience. There's a contradiction there.
We are tonight's entertainment.
The most interesting case study here is The Dark Knight, which, content-wise, has been the superhero movie most interested in grappling with the ethics of vigilante justice. Batman lives by a strict moral code of never killing anyone and never using guns, but his vigilanteism is proven to be insufficient by both a posse of gun-toting Batman copycats who show the danger of his lifestyle, as well as by District Attorney Harvey Dent, who does Batman's job with a greater sense of legitimacy. He is the White Knight to Batman's Dark Knight. The movie eventually suggests that someone like Batman should ideally be working alongside legitimate forms of criminal justice. But then that justice is also potentially corrupted by the invention of the surveillance state. And here's where we see a breakdown between form and content. Lucius Fox pays lip service to the idea that this government invasiveness is unethical and wrong.
Dangerous. This is wrong.
But the form of the movie makes it seem so cool. It's a sweeping CGI spectacle shot wholly in IMAX. But more so than anything else, any ideas this movie might be suggesting about the legitimacy of state or vigilante violence is undercut by Heath Ledger's extremely magnetic performance as the Joker. His threatening speeches are far and away the most viscerally exciting and fun part of the movie, leaving audience members feeling most fond of the film's most anarchic agent of violence.
All it takes is a little push.
That's a breakdown of content and form that sends a pretty mixed message. But more often than not in movies like this, there is no contradiction. The action movie form suggests that violence is thrilling, and the movie's content suggests that vigilante violence is good, as is the case in both of the recent Punisher films. The creator of the Punisher comic book has been very outspoken about this character being a cautionary tale rather than a role model, but the 2004 film is just overly sadistic in its deployment of male rage, exciting the audience very conventionally, and ending on a big, victorious speech about how violence is this guy's reason for living.
Those who do evil to others, killers, rapists, psychos, sadists, will come to know me well. Frank Castle is dead. Call me the Punisher.
And while Lexi Alexander's Punisher Warzone does discuss the idea that this is a character worth criticizing, her film also makes the action sequences into its most thrilling ones and ends on a pretty blunt note suggesting that, yeah, maybe we do just need more angry dudes to kill muggers. In both of these Punisher films, content and form match up exactly, and they're pretty persuasive, albeit in a scary sort of way. The relationship between content and form is a crucial one if a movie wants to be effective and persuasive in its treatment of anything, especially violence. Getting it wrong or getting it right in the wrong direction can have massive consequences for what feeling an audience is left with after watching the film, which is maybe one reason why the Joker has become a bit of a mascot among people who define themselves in opposition to SJWs, or why the Punisher skull has become a weirdly popular symbol among people who define themselves in opposition to Black Lives Matter. But in the case of Unbreakable, the only big action set piece we get is withheld until the last 15 minutes of the movie, all done in one slow-moving take and shot from above with a sense of detachment. This is the form of slow cinema taking the thrill out of male rage, so that when the final scene hits and David Dunn's whole sense of self is undercut, the movie really sells it. When you tell a story like this, in the form of slow cinema, which often engages the audience not through action, but through restraint and introspection, you get a great movie like Unbreakable, which both in form and in content suggests that emotional repression and violence are just more traps that men can get caught in.